Assalamu alaikum, everyone. May peace and blessings be with all. We would like to now start the webinar, the titled "Race to Justice." We have a lineup of some great speakers online, and we will. The format will be that each speaker will speak for a few minutes, share their thoughts on different topics that we have assigned to them, and then eventually we will move on to. We'll move on to the question and answer sessions. You can put in your question and answers through YouTube or Facebook, and we will try to accommodate them at the end. So, because we have a packed agenda, I will start. I'm gonna limit my intros for speakers too, so that you could hear them talk rather than me introducing them. So first up, we have Musab Abdali. He's a board member of ICNA Council of Social Justice. He's very active in grassroots work, specifically in where he was Houston and now Dallas, connecting with inner city communities and uplifting them with programs for the community. So if we can have Brother Musab, please share your thoughts on this very important issue.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. The issue of structural racism is something that has found itself in the spotlight with yet another brutal killing and inhumane treatment caught on video of African American brother George Floyd. And although in the past years we have seen protests and marches and all sorts of outrage, rightful outrage by the community after these brutal killings several years ago. We know Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and then we saw with Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. But I think this latest killing that was caught on camera, and a list of more of other killings that can probably take up the rest of the program if we were to go down and list the name and the date and what happened. But I think this last brutal killing of George Floyd and how it was caught on video and the way that it was, quickly uploaded into social media and then made rounds, it raises the consciousness within the community. And it reminds us, we have many communities, much of the Muslim community, the immigrant Muslim community specifically, we're seeing this conversation being had along with so many of the other communities in this country. I remember even watching some conservative talk shows where they were even talking about how brutal and how unjust this killing was. And it really reminds us as a community, as a nation, of where we come from. In this past week, I was asked by a number of youth groups because of the quarantine, instead of doing programs in person, they're doing programs online where we were covering this issue of structural racism. How did we get where we are? How did we get to a point in this country which claims to be the most civil country on the face of the earth, the leader of freedom and liberty and justice? And we, in this country, are at a point where we are seeing an officer so casually, so calmly murdering an individual who's begging for his life. And he's doing it so calmly because he knows that there will be no repercussions. How did we get here? And so a number of youth groups asked me to kind of make a presentation about this. And I made a presentation called What They Didn't Teach Us in School, talking to high school and college students. And I went through simply by taking concepts found in books like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy, Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. Just taking these historical concepts, taking these historical events, and it reminds us that we indeed live in a nation where structural racism and the oppression and tyranny against poor people of color in this class system, this racial system, it's something that's been there since the inception of this nation, since the beginning of the founding of this country. We have seen that our legal system, our political system has been built upon oppressing and keeping a group of people at the bottom. And different strategic tactics have been deployed. And as one tactic fades it comes back and rears its ugly head in a more brutal form. And so this notion that a lot of times we hear in many communities is that, you know, slavery is something of the past. That's not really the case, because we see through structural racism, what this teaches us is that that same chattel slavery, after it was gone, it reincarnated itself through the black codes, through the Jim Crow, through segregation. And after each one falls, it comes back in a more brutal way. And then we see this prison industrial complex, this mass incarceration system, which is built upon imprisoning and disenfranchising an entire community of people, and majority poor people of color, specifically within many parts of the African American community and increasingly the Latino community. And this concept of police brutality is one aspect of it. We see that the same laws are policed completely differently. And these no longer can be dismissed as conspiracy theories, because there's evidence, there's statistics, there's books that document this. Just as a quick example, I know there's a lot of speakers and many more qualified than me, and I'd like to, obviously give them the time to speak on these issues, which they will be. But if we can look at one example, we know that the country is now moving to a point where they're legalizing marijuana. However, in the past, several decades, we know that marijuana has very strict laws in terms of possession and selling. And we know that there's very strict punishments through the state governments. However, if you look at the health statistics, it shows us that the marijuana usage is fairly even through the various classes and various ethnic groups. However, if you look at the numbers of people throughout the country in every single state who are imprisoned for marijuana-related crimes, whether it's possession or distribution, it is overwhelmingly comes from poor people of color, majority young African-American men and young Latino men. And that just tells us that there is a disparity in that, because there's a disparity in the policing, where you have, streets of poor communities of color have much more strict policing, and they have, the stops and the searches and all those things, all those strategies used by the police are far more frequent in those communities, and the brutality is far more frequent in those communities, as we are seeing now. It is, now it can be seen on video and spread through social media like wildfire when it happens. And so we really need to utilize this, and I commend ICNA and the various groups and the various speakers on here that this issue of what happened to our dear brother George Floyd, it is brutal, but it is not an anomaly. It is not something that happens once in a while. It's something that happens extremely frequently. It's just we were blessed that there was someone there with the presence of mind and the opportunity to record the entire thing, which set off these historic protests throughout the country, rightfully so. But as I conclude, this is called structural racism. It is a systematic brutality against a community of people, majority poor communities of color. And protests, although they are organized, they have been organized in the past few weeks, and a number of movements and organizations have contributed to this. Protests are not enough. If we're fighting structural racism and systematic discrimination, then our protest against it must also be structural and systematic. As Muslims, as communities of faith, as believers in God, as followers in the prophets of God, our responsibility is to submit ourselves to God and to stand up against oppression, tyranny, and injustice. The missions of the prophets, the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that our submission to God is synonymous with standing up for justice. And if we truly want to combat this system of structural racism, our method for fighting structural racism must also be systematic and must also be structural. And that's something that I think we really need to focus on. We need to mobilize, we need to organize, we need to plan. The rise in the consciousness in the community that we're seeing, where we're actually talking about racism, we're actually recognizing this brutality, and then we're going out and we're marching on the streets. That's the first step. But what we really need to do is, once the hype dies down, as it will inevitably, as it always does, we need to keep our foot on the gas. We need to continue to mobilize. We need to continue to strategize, continue to have these discussions, build alliances and coalitions with other communities of faith, and we need to really attack this issue systematically if we want to, create a dent in this terrible atrocity, this terrible discriminatory system that is oppressing poor communities of color that's been doing since the inception of this nation. And so with that, I wanted to keep it brief, and with that, I will turn it back over to the moderator. I think he'll be joining us, and then he'll be introducing the next speaker.
Thank you, Musab, for explaining us some of the inherent systems that we have in place and how to tackle them. Next up, for talking about racial inequality, we have Mark Crane. Mark is a community organizer in the Metro Detroit area. He's the co-founder of Empowered Change and Dream of Detroit, both doing some great works in grassroots community development. So if we can have Brother Mark up on the screen.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's an honor to be with you all this afternoon. Very grateful to ICNA for hosting this conversation and for the esteemed panelists that you've gathered here today. So I was asked to speak on a couple of things. One, how has racial inequality further polarized U.S. society? And, I found this to be an interesting question because we have to realize that racism in this country, and when we talk about this country, we talk explicitly about how racism has exercised itself here, which is why we use the phrase white supremacy. Right, it's a way to specify. It's not some sort of indication that racism is exclusive to one group of people, that it only goes in one direction. Right, it's not that, but it's just an analysis of the specific context of this country. And what I mean to say is that it hasn't further polarized U.S. society. It's the very basis of the polarization. And so part of the work that we have to do is just increasing in knowledge coming out of moments like this, because we have to understand and not just understand at a paper level, at a I read it in a textbook level, but really understand at the depths of what it means for a human experience and what it meant for people living in that time. That Black people in this country were actually defined in our Constitution as 3/5 of a person, right? Defined as less than a whole person. And even then, only given that much value for the purposes of getting bargaining power in Congress for slaveholding states. So it wasn't like, oh, we'll give them this much humanity. We'll give them 3/5 of a person. It was actually like, this is how much we can get value for, to get more representatives in Congress, to get more control over the laws, to benefit our economic system more. So when you think about that, when you think about Taney and the Dred Scott decision saying that the white man in this country there are no laws that the white man is bound to respect with respect to the Negro, right? There's like the time after time at the highest levels of the country, the precedent has been set that race is what differentiates us. Race is what gives one group of people value and totally strips it away from another group of people. So it's not that it further polarizes, but that it's been there from the very beginning, right? And so obviously, there's a 500-year history here that we won't do in 3 minutes. But But that's one of the main things that I've been encouraging people to take away from this moment is to learn. And I'll give a couple of ways later about how I think we can get active. But I've been trying to tell folks that we actually, coming out of this moment, you don't have to become a racial justice activist necessarily, right? This might be a political awakening moment or a moment of awakening of consciousness for you, but you don't have to become a racial justice advocate necessarily. But you do need to move more toward becoming an anti-racist. You need to be interrogating the system a little bit more. How is it that this man could feel no remorse whatsoever as he choked the life out of another man in front of a crowd with his hands in his pockets casually? How is it that not only at a personal level he could be so deprived, but that at a societal level he could actually expect that there would be no repercussion, and that there would have to be uprisings in the streets for there to be simple repercussions, and that there's still no guarantee that there would be a conviction, and that we've had this same cycle over and over again? Right. So if this is a moment where there's been like an awakening and you've been listening to some of the incredible talks from some of our shuyukh, Imam Dawood Walid has been giving incredible talks. Sheikh Abdul Karim Yahya gave an incredible talk on Friday. Imam Mikhail Sadiq is giving great talks around these issues right now. If you're hearing these things and you're feeling like awakened, you don't have to become a racial justice activist overnight, but you should become an anti-racist. Right? You should become, you should start to, again, peel back those layers, understand the root causes when you see inequities in this country. And in a place like Detroit, just to give, a few facts, we're talking about a city that, and we won't go back 200, 300 years, but we're talking about last century, a city that in 1947 had 545,000 housing units and only 47,000 available to Black people, right? And we have this narrative of the Great Migration, bringing Black folks up here and them getting jobs in the auto industry and the whole city swelling. And do you hear that I just said less than a tenth of the Black housing units in the city were available to Black folks? So, right, in a city where into the 1960s, Black people routinely spent 30% more on rent than white Detroiters, 30% more on rent than white Detroiters. Right. And then you fast forward, to modern day housing in Detroit, and you've got, this system where we have data showing that that folks with higher value properties in the city of Detroit are being underassessed on their taxes, while the poorest Detroiters, some of the oldest Detroiters, and some of the Blackest neighborhoods are all being overassessed systematically. Right. So this is history and this is modern day. This is what we mean when we talk about, systems. It's not just that the racist ideas, because we approach, the reconciliation of those, the defeat of those racist ideas and reconciliation of the trauma that it causes on an individual level. But we focus on the systems because the racism turns into racist policy, which turn into racist laws, which get enacted by racist power holders. And it's a cycle. Right. So, Detroit is this incredible case of, just incredible history. And we can talk about migration of Black folks to Detroit and the patterns they followed as they moved through the city and why only certain neighborhoods were available at certain times, racial covenants, the history of redlining, which was the federal government, denying Black folks the same access to loans as white folks were getting to start new lives in the suburbs. We can talk about all of those things. But I just want to pivot and end with a conversation on police reform, because that is the issue of the moment. Criminal legal system reform, not criminal justice system, but criminal legal system, because we're still trying to establish justice, right? So, Detroit is an interesting case because we've had Black political power in this city to significant levels for a very long time. And in fact, our first Black mayor, Coleman Young, ran on a platform of police reform, disbanding a brutal unit that was in the Detroit Police Department called the Stress Unit. And so Detroit's a city where, a majority of the folks on the police force are Black folks, have long-term relation to the city, to folks in the city, et cetera. Detroit is not a place where we experience the same degree of police violence as we see in Ferguson, where they were building the city treasury off the backs of tickets on Black people, or what we see in Minneapolis year after year. It's not the same, but the point is that isn't actually sufficient. We have to move, the call of the moment is to defund police and to figure out what that means on a local level for you. Because even if the term defund police seems a little bit radical when you first hear it, when you start looking at policies on a local level, there are a lot that you're going to be able to get behind. Because I promise you, you don't believe that Predator drones should be flying over our cities monitoring protests, right? You don't believe that tanks should be transferred to local police departments and brought out to intimidate citizens who have a right to peacefully gather. You don't believe that the media should be being attacked. And we have video after video after video of the last 2 weeks of media being attacked by local police forces, trying to cause a media blackout of what's happening on the streets, right? You don't believe that these departments should have the type of funding to enact those atrocities. Ayanna Stanley Jones, the 7-year-old girl who died in Detroit a little over 10 years ago, who was killed in a midnight raid. You have to understand that this raid was being filmed for a TV show. You understand the complicity here? The raid was being filmed for a show that was going to be put on TV to glorify and further spread the good word of police forces. And in all their bravado and showmanship, they broke into a house and killed an innocent little 7-year-old girl. And why do we even use the word innocent? They broke into the house and killed this little girl, 7 years old, in the middle of the night for a TV show. To look good, to reinforce the system so there can be more funding, to do more publicity, to make it look better, to further militarize it, to further bring in troops from other countries to train American police forces how to subdue and oppress. So please, I just want to close with saying that, like, we at this point should be beyond having any trouble saying Black Lives Matter, that statement. I'm not asking you to go get involved in your local Black Lives Matter chapter. As a Muslim, I'm asking you not to circumvent Black Muslims when it comes to racial justice work in this country. Number one, you don't have to be a racial justice activist. You can focus on being an anti-racist, doing that daily habitual work to get rid of your own biases, challenging it in your family, standing up against it in your workplaces. But beyond that, you can locally support efforts that are led by Black Muslims who have been doing racial justice work in all of its forms and building community and power for the Black community for years. Don't circumvent that leadership when it comes time for a moment like this. So Jazakallah khair. It's really great again to be in conversation with everyone. Forgive me if I went over time, but very grateful for ICNA and all that you do. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
Thank you, Brother Mark. So Jazakallah khair for the insight specifically relating to the Detroit community and all that we could do here. Next up, what we have Imam Ilahi. Imam Ilahi is the spiritual leader of the Islamic House of Wisdom in Dearborn Heights. And, to kind of sum it up, he and his team is at the forefront of all social causes and interfaith outreach, all sort of social justice causes. So without taking much time from him, I would pass on the screen to him to kind of talk a little bit to us about the Islamic perspective of racial equality.
Thank you, Brother Pan. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is a great honor to be part of this panel, and pleasure to be with all of you, and also Congressman Andy Levin. Probably he would tell us later on about this good news of police reform legislation that I think is going to be presented to Congress tomorrow. I hope that this bill won't be banned by the rest of people and the White House, but that is a good news. We know that the call against brutality, injustice, and racism did not start in May 25th in Minneapolis with the murder of George Floyd. Abuse of power and having authority without accountability, and this pandemic of racism and discrimination existed long before even we have this pandemic of coronavirus. But now, this time, these two pandemic met and made the situation more horrible. I mean, when the bishops in Washington, D.C. got outraged after having the president having a picture in front of their church, and normally any clergy would be proud to see the president comes and stands in front of his or her church and taking a photo. But they were so angry of witnessing how people were forced to leave the church area under fear and fire and anger. And then the president just comes and take a photo in the middle of this chaos and confusion. And they were angry that really you need to open this book and read it. Bible is not just a piece of paper for picture, but it is about faith and fulfillment. And you need to open it and see what does Bible say about says about justice, for example. As the case in the Quran. Quran is a holy book with over 6,200 verses, but the first verse is Iqra, read. When you read, you remember, you reflect, you learn, you understand. And when you have understanding, you have sympathy with other people, you have empathy, you respect, you build relationship. And when there is respect and good relationship, then there is reconciliation, there is peace, there is brotherhood, there is love. Everything starts from reading. So that is the first verse in the Quran. As a matter of fact, the Quran itself, this Arabic word Al-Quran, means something to read. And it's interesting that when it comes to the issue of justice, there are over 100 verses in the Bible about justice and against oppression. And there are so many verses that are very similar. For example, the Quran says, "Inna Allah yuhibbul muqsidin." God loves those who observe justice. And the Bible said, "Blessed are those who observe justice." Another verse, the Quran says, "La'natullah ala dhalimin, inna Allah la yuhibbu dhalimin." God doesn't love those who practice oppression and injustice. And the Bible said, "Curse be on anyone who perverts the justice and exercise injustice." So it's really similarities that here and there talking about justice as a commandment, as an order from God, not just an option, but as obligation for everyone. But unfortunately, when this situation started, the leadership, instead of providing light and logic and bring reconciliation and unity, we saw how double standard and dishonesty and disrespect made this situation even more horrible, to the point that the good thing about it is that we see that now not only African American and many people in every community, white community, Muslims, Jewish, Christians, all communities, and even the political leaders, even the military leaders, ended up today with Colin Powell's statement. This unity against this injustice and racism, this time shows something different is happening. I mean, the protest against injustice and racism is not new, long time, but we never observe that much energy and dynamism and support for for example, Black Lives Matter, or for justice. We want justice now. I cannot breathe. No justice, no peace. The only thing we need is our leaders really to listen to what these people are talking about. What is it that bothers the protesters? Just to listen and to learn. They want justice. They want equality. They want to stop brutality. They want to end the abuse of power. They want to end oppression. And just listen to them. Not to put politics before honesty, before values, before principles, before constitutions, before common sense. I mean, it's not that when people with arm protested in Lansing and they occupied the actually the legislation location, we heard that the president was saying that, oh, the forces of liberation. But then in this situation, using a very, very disrespectful language, not only in the national level. For example, when in other countries, when president was in India and during his visit, over 200 people were killed or wounded in India because of their faith, because of their demands. We didn't hear even one word of condemnation over there. But if this happened in another nation that in different political relationship, we hear tens of tweets from presidents saying, oh, we follow you, we support you, we stand for you, you are courageous, this. So when we have a crisis like that, we have a crisis of coronavirus, and we have a crisis, a virus even worse than coronavirus, the virus of racism and the disease of discrimination, the pandemic of prejudice. When we deal with these issues, we need to be honest, and we need to deal with this matter in honorable way. And this is what we see that the entire country, even the generals who are under the president, they are saying that this way is wrong. You cannot deal with the situation like this and using all these languages. In Islam, as a religion who is very much anti-racism. I mean, we know the story of Bilal. We know the story of Salman. We know so many other stories that there was no tolerance for Jahiliyyah, no tolerance for racism in the Sunnah, in the tradition of the Holy Prophet. When Abu Dhar, no matter how honest and faithful he was, and he was loved by the Prophet, he had an argument with Bilal, and one word he said, Yabna Sauda, that your mother was black. When Bilal reported to the Prophet was so upset. When Abu Dhar went to apologize, the Prophet was so upset that he didn't want to answer his greeting and answer his salam. When Abu Dhar, he found Bilal and he put his face on the floor and asked Bilal to put his foot on Abu Dhar's face to make sure that he is forgiven. Of course, Bilal, he came and he kissed Abu Dhar and he forgave him. And he said, I know you are faithful. I know you are loving. It just one case happened. But this shows that there was no room for racism in our face. And also in our constitution, in civil rights, in the movement of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, all were about opposition to racism, that racism is coming from ignorance, racism coming from arrogance, racism is part of ego and selfishness. And what we expect from the leaders, and especially the president, who claims to be a president of law and order, to really follow the law, follow the logic, and provides light instead of using the term of shooting and using the term of vicious dogs for people who disagreed with him. So this is really the time that we as people of faith, whether Muslims, Christians, Jews, to remind our leaders that racism is wrong, and justice is a fundamental order. The Quran says it, that all the messengers came with one goal, لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ. And also the Bible says the same thing, and it says that follow justice even if that is against you. If justice hurts you, justice hurts your walidain or aqrabin, doesn't matter. Be just even to your enemies, even to your enemies. Justice is a principle. And then you come to constitution. Not only the Quran says that all the messengers, Moses, Jesus, Abraham, Muhammad, all of them came with one mission to establish justice. But even the constitution says, the first page of our constitution, US Constitution, says that the purpose of this constitution is to establish justice. And it is bothering when somebody like Colin Powell, he says that the president now deviated from justice, deviated from constitution, means deviated from justice, deviated from equality, which is the value that people deserve. And no one, whether black or white, whether it was George Floyd or Ahmad Albury, or nobody deserved to die like that. Nobody deserves to be treated like that. So I hope that this amazing, unprecedented movement that looks like a revolution against racism be honored, and this national conversation continues to the point that the police department is reformed, and the reformation and correction is all over, that nobody, because of his race or because of his religion or because of ethnicity, is going to be respected anymore in this country. We pray for that, but we need to act on that, and we need to continue this conversation and dialogue as strong as it is today.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Imam Ilahi, for sharing some of the insights from a religious perspective. Next up, we have Dr. Ahmed Ghanem. He is going to be speaking to us about racism, specifically pertaining to the immigrant community here in the Metro Detroit area. Dr. Ghanem is a social justice and civil rights activist in the Metro Detroit area, and also the co-founder of another very grassroots organization to mobilize people of Metro Detroit, the Metro Detroit Political Action Network. So without further ado, Dr. Ahmed Ghanem.
Thank you, brother. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Ahmed Ghanem. I am a proud Muslim immigrant, American citizen. As an immigrant to the United States, I wanted just to give you a different perspective about how I look at the African-American struggle and the African-American story in the United States. Because I, as an immigrant, I owe a lot to the African-Americans in the United States. I was not here in the United States when Nat Turner revolted, but I consider myself part of this political revolution. I was not here during the Civil War or during years and years of political struggle, but I owe my freedom and my civil rights to the heroes that sacrificed during the Civil War, during the political struggle over years and years. I was not here during Brown versus Board of Education, but now I can send my brown kids to any school of my choice. I was not here when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus, but now I can enjoy choosing any seat on any public transportation because of her. I was not part of the sit-in in Greensboro in the 60s, but because of those heroes, I can go to any restaurant, I can go to any public place, and I don't have to be seated in any segregated place. So as an immigrant, as someone came to the United States, and as part of this immigrant community, I would like to show our appreciation to the African-American community, because all what we have, all the rights that we have is the fruit of your struggle. As an immigrant, I can only imagine how my life and the life of my family would look like without years and years of struggle of our dear brothers and sisters in the African-American community. The life will be much different. the country, the United States, America, will be much different without your struggle over years and years. I think as an immigrant, I can attribute every single right that I have right now in every single detail in my life to a point of history. I can link it to a point of history where a hero, an African American hero, stood up for justice and freedom, not just for the African Americans, but for all races, for all immigrants, for all people of color, to have this kind of freedom and has this kind of civil rights. The African American struggle was and will always be a worldwide inspiration for freedom fighters everywhere. I remember when I was a kid in Egypt, learning about Martin Luther King, learning about Malcolm X, learning about Rosa Parks, and thinking how those people have changed the world. And they impacted me. I think this is part of why I wanted to be a political activist. I wanted to be a better human being. One of the things that Malcolm X said when I remember it when I was a kid back in Egypt, before I even thinking about coming to the United States, that you do not need to be a political activist to change the world or to restore justice. All what you need is to be a decent human being. This universal message from the African American leaders are actually echoing all over the globe. This is why I want my African American brothers and sisters to understand that from the year 1400 to the year 2020, from Emmett Till George Floyd, your struggle will never go in vain. You were not fighting just for African American rights in America. You were leading the global fight for justice. So kids in Africa and Asia and all over the globe can be inspired and can start their own fight for all their freedom. If you hear the news right now, you can see the protests actually happening everywhere in the world. Happening in London, happening in Europe, happening in parts of Africa, happening in Asia. And that tells you one thing, that the African American struggle is a universal phenomena, is a universal inspiration. I myself was inspired by it. And that doesn't mean that everything is fine right now. And doesn't mean that every group in the United States have their own rights right now. We are far from fine. But we came that far because of your sacrifice. So I want to thank you. I want to thank thousands of heroes that maybe I will never know their names, that lived under very, very difficult conditions, but they kept fighting. So me and my kids and all immigrants and all people of colors in the United States can enjoy some of these civil rights. And this is why I'm talking here as an immigrant. I'm not talking here as a founder, a co-founder of MD PAN, this grassroots organization that works in Detroit. I'm actually working here to see what can I do as an immigrant. And I don't want to talk a long time because the time is running. So I just want to be brief that two things that I'm actually pointing out as an immigrant. We are, as an immigrant community, we are not immune from this racism. There is so much racism going on inside this immigrant community. We are suffering from racism. We have not just one police, we have our own police. We have the ICE, which is an extra layer of policing the immigrants. And we have so much stress and so much racism that comes toward us when people hear our accent or see our color or hear our funny names, which is fine. We are inspired by our dear brothers and sisters, our African American heroes, to keep fighting for our rights. But the most important fight, I think we should take it home to our immigrant community. Because in our immigrant community, we have two fronts that we have to fight. First, we have to educate. So our immigrant community will know the true history of the United States and the history of the struggle of the Black American community here in the United States. And understand that our fight here as an immigrant community for our right is a continuation to their fight. And every right we have is the fruit of their struggle. The second thing, to teach our immigrants, dear brothers and sisters, how they cannot be part of this structural economic injustice against our poor people, especially the poor people in cities, in inner cities. You know that most are, there is, I don't want to be generalizing here, but there is big portion of businesses that owned inside the inner cities that serves our poor dear brothers and sisters in these communities are owned by immigrants. And without they know, without their bad intention, they actually became part of this structural injustice, structural economic injustice against those people that's supposed to serve, that's supposed to admire and supposed to help. So we have this problem, the racism inside the immigrant community. We have this structural, you came to this community and you start your own shop, but you became part of this structural economic injustice against them by overcharging them, by doing all these things that shouldn't be done, all this bad behavior, economic behavior against them. So you are part of them. You are part of this injustice against them. And this is very, very difficult conversation we have to have inside our immigrant community. It's not easy. It's part of accumulations of years and years of practices, bad practices inside our immigrant community. But the good thing is we are starting this conversation and we'll keep pushing to it. This is the one of the minor things that we owe to our dear brothers and sisters. At least if we cannot be allies to them, if we cannot stand by them, which we should do, we should not be part of the war, especially the economic war against them. Dear brothers and sisters, thank you for having me today. I will leave the rest of my time for the speakers after me. Thank you, and may Allah bless your day. Well, if you are not going to take it, I can continue to talk if you. Because I see we have only 15 minutes and we have another 3 speakers coming, so it's not good for me to keep talking. So I would rather leave it to the great speakers coming after me. I don't know if I'm still online.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed. Sorry, there was some sort of technical difficulties in the back that we weren't able to switch. So Jazakallah khair. And again, that was a very important conversation that Dr. Ghanem was pointing out to within the immigrant community. So moving up next, we have another great speaker. We have Imam Dawood Walid. He's the executive director of the Michigan chapter of CARE. I mean, overall, just, just a high-level summary of his bio is that a very well-rounded person. He's served in the U.S. Navy. He has studied Arabic and traditional Islamic sciences. He's served as an imam, an author, and the list goes on and on. But I won't take much time. So, Brother Dawood Walid, for the road to the future.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sallam wa ba'd. So, brothers and sisters, I have very limited time, so we're talking about the road going to the future. But in going forward in the future, we have to understand not only where we're at, but where we started. And I want to underscore something that Brother Mark Crane said, may Allah preserve him. I think it's a very important point to put an exclamation point on, that part of our way moving forward in the future is readjusting our framework and readjusting how we perceive things so that we may move forward in a better way. So as we see the issue of police brutality that's take place in the United States of America, which has always taken place, in the issue of systemic racism in America, We need to stop as a community saying that the system is broken. The system in America is not broken. The system in America is operating exactly the way it was designed to act, starting with the overseers on plantations, trying to keep Black people in check, and then the Reconstruction era and how law enforcement was established in America and our incarceration system from debtor's prison to the issue of mass incarceration today is operating as it was designed by the so-called founding fathers of this country. So that's one thing that we need to get straight. The second thing is getting straight is that we as Muslims, we should be empathizing and commiserating more with the oppressed instead of trying to identify with those in the status quo. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, وَلَا تَرْكُنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا فَتَمَسَّكُمُ النَّارُ, and do not incline yourselves upon those who are wrongdoers or the system of oppression, lest the fire shall touch you. You know, during the Khilafah of Umar ibn al-Khattab, that he was so concerned about the plight of minorities and the plight of the hungry that he felt that he himself was responsible if there was one person who was hungry under the lands in which he governed. And when there was mass famine at one point in time during his government, that he made excuses and he actually suspended the punishment for those who were stealing out of desperation. And I like to let you take a look at that, or even when you maybe are overly judgmental of some of the people who you see have been involved in some so-called looting, people who've lost their jobs because of COVID-19, who were already oppressed, people who have been denied of any type of generational wealth, and maybe out of desperation this time, maybe have gone and done some looting. I want you to put that into perspective in Islamic history. Or when Ali ibn Abi Talib, when he was the Khalifa, he said, if poverty was a man, I would kill him. If poverty was a man, then I would kill him. So we should get our language right. Also, in terms of steps moving forward, and I want to be very clear about this, that we as Muslims, we have to be more concerned about principles than personalities and parties. Our brother Mark also mentioned the tragic murder of a young girl in Detroit about 10 years ago, Ayanna Stanley Jones. I actually went to the home of that family the morning after her murder by the Detroit police. Actually, the late Ron Scott, who led the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality, called me. I went there and spoke with the family and saw the fresh blood on the sofa and with the no-knock warrant that was used in that operation, similarly to the no-knock warrant that was used so many other times before. We know about the killing of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. I want to remind you that it was a Democrat who was the police chief at the time, a Democratic mayor. Actually, Warren Evans was the chief of police at that time. Just as we've seen an undermining of the Detroit Police Commission under a Democratic mayor, Mike Duggan. So when we have these politicians and meet with them, keep in mind the words of Malcolm X about the wolf and the fox. Just because some people come and smile in our faces doesn't mean that they necessarily hold all of our best interests. And we need to be a community that just simply gets out of photo ops and hold our elected officials accountable. And it doesn't matter simply because they're in the Democratic Party and say some bad things about, or they criticize Trump, because the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the pudding. In other communities who have dignity, they hold people accountable, and we just don't say we invite people to our programs and take pictures, and that's enough for them to get our campaign contributions or to get our votes. That's not enough. Those days need to be gone. Those days should be over, and we need to hold these people accountable. The final thing I'll say is we need to support efforts. There's national efforts talking about defunding the police as far as the over militarization of the police. There are efforts such as trying to stop the facial recognition cameras in the city of Detroit. There's actually an important meeting about this tomorrow at 10 o'clock, in which Councilwoman Pro Tem Mary Sheffield has been on our side and trying to do away with this problematic technology, right? About seeking to support legislation of doing away with these no-knock warrants that have killed so many innocent people, right? But I also tell you that we cannot legislate or adjudicate away racism in America. No set of laws in and of themselves, or no amount of court cases in amongst themselves can do away with racism, because at the end of the day, the roots of racism relates to spiritual maladies and spiritual diseases. So we as Muslims need to bring forth a different discourse, not just a materialistic discourse, but to bring forth a spiritual discourse and a spiritual exemplification here in Metro Detroit and in Michigan that can show a different model of how we can shift culture, about how white Muslims, people who are converts, and people from Albania and Bosnia and Macedonia, because we have all of them here, work with South Asians, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Indians, and work with different groups of Arabs and Africans and African Americans to show and be a living example of what racial equity really means, about loving one's brother and loving one's neighbor, what it really means, about what justice really means, that justice doesn't mean just us. Justice doesn't mean just for our group, right? That we need to exemplify this, right? And if we are able to deal with these issues, these spiritual maladies in our community and exemplify them and give remedies to the spiritual malady of arrogance and racial pride, which undermines the issue of racism on a systemic level, the issues of envy, also emanating from this greed. If we can exemplify this as Muslims, brothers and sisters in Islam, then I think we will do a great service to the United States of America, to help America heal from the cancer of the false ideology of white supremacy, and to make America be what Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, but never lived himself. And what he wrote is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we pray to Almighty God to empower us to do those works that are pleasing to him, and to do the service to our country, the United States of America, and to help rid America of the scourge of the false ideology of white supremacy.
Jazakallah khair, Imam Dawood Walid. That was really good. Shared some really good thoughts on what needs to be done to promise ourselves a better future. Just to remind all the viewers that we will be taking questions from all the panelists at the end of the discussion, the panel that we have. So please feel free to write your questions in the Facebook chat or the YouTube live chat, and we will entertain them at the end. And finally, last but not the least, we have our very own Congressman Andy Levin, who would be talking to us about change through political activism. Just a brief highlight of Andy's work. He has been a union organizer, a human rights activist, a policy expert, and he's spent his career fighting for equitable and inclusive future, and now he represents us in the Congress for Michigan's 9th District. In my own words, if I were to describe, I'd say a man of principle who's always found standing on the right side of equality, justice, and do right. So without further ado, Representative Andy Levin.
Thank you so much, Sharik. Salaam alaikum to everybody. Thanks so much to ICNA for giving me the opportunity to join you today and for facilitating this really critical conversation. I wish I could be with everybody in person, especially at a moment like this when we need to stand together as a movement, quite literally. but I feel a sense of community speaking with you this afternoon anyway. So I'm really honored to be here, and especially to be in the company of Mark and Imam Daoud Walid and Imam Alahi and Ahmed and Musab. They've done so much in fights for justice leading up to this moment, and they will definitely be among the folks leading the way forward. I'm honored to be part of this conversation today, too, because I know that while systemic racism has had an impact on every person of color on this call, it's not your problem to solve alone. Indeed, it's primarily a problem created by white people, benefiting white people. It's my problem. We must always follow the leadership of people of color, but we've got to do the work with our white friends, family, and neighbors. I'm focused on using my platform in whatever way I can to bring white people along to do real anti-racist reflection and work. I'm working with my staff on how we can connect with our constituents, or frankly, anyone really willing to do this work, to talk about anti-racism in a global pandemic with record unemployment and now righteous civil rights unrest over senseless murders and lynchings, all of which is acutely impacting people of color. And I know we've seen moments like this come and go before. In the last 20 years, how many videos have we seen? And how many things were swept under the rug because there was no video, as there wasn't for most of our history? While it sometimes seems there will never be a Black victim perfect enough to shake this country awake to the realities of police brutality, something about this moment does seem different. During this pandemic, when almost everything is slowed down or stopped, it's evident that racism in America has not. Over the last few months, we are witnessing violence, police brutality, and targeted harassment towards Black Americans, no matter about shutdowns or stay-at-home orders. And we're all at home watching this. The other noise has drifted to the background, and the frustrations over inequities has reached a crescendo in this pandemic. Who has access to healthcare? Who has technology available to teach their children? Who's able to have running water to wash their hands like we're all told to do? Who is able to be safe, even simply to live? And the answer all too often is not Black America. This pandemic laid bare our generations of injustices heaped upon our Black sisters and brothers. And then the murder of George Floyd, coming on the heels of so many other incidents, reminded us of one of the greatest threats they face every single day, which is police brutality. And we're also seeing how slow we are to get accountability. How long a white officer who murders somebody can walk free. How mostly white armed protesters at our state capitol here in Lansing can intimidate legislators and officers alike. We're seeing just how protective white supremacy is and why many white people are so eager to uphold it and hang on to power. And again, dismantling that is every white person's work, every white anti-racist person's work anyway at this moment. So there's much work to be done on a personal level and interpersonal level, but that's not to say that there aren't policy changes needed too. Some of you may have heard me talk before about the need to get our country's bloated military in order. If we fail to do this, we will continue to invest adequately in priorities at home, like our crumbling infrastructure and the safety of our water. And people of color disproportionately suffer the consequences of that austerity at home because of our bloated military budgets. But there's another reason this is so important. The Department of Defense has surplus military equipment that it's sending to local police departments. Equipment like weaponized drones and grenade launchers. We've seen this with our own eyes this very week. That's why I'm an original co-sponsor of the Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act, introduced by Congressman Hank Johnson of Georgia, to end the transfers of equipment that has no place on our streets and in our communities. But this is just one example of the kinds of changes we need on the federal level. There's much, much more to be done. And my staff and I will spend the days and weeks ahead focused like a laser on that. I'm proud to support the work of the House Judiciary Committee and the Congressional Black Caucus in examining police brutality to identify comprehensive legislation that will address the crisis of racial profiling, excessive force used by law enforcement, and the lost trust between police departments and the communities they serve. Yes, we're even hearing about defunding of police departments. And I forget which of my brothers spoke about this earlier, but there's really, don't just get your back up when you hear about this. It's not about like no police versus what we have now. It's a question of what are our priorities? What are we going to fund with our precious resources? We will be announcing as early as tomorrow a package of reforms. And I'm not going to steal the thunder of the Congressional Black Caucus by, detailing them, but I'll say that there will be a multi-pronged attack on white supremacy and police brutality coming from the House of Representatives. I'll wrap up there. We hear a lot that it's the job of white people to listen in racial justice spaces. In addition to being a white guy, I'm a congressman. And I really see listening as the most important part of my job in Congress as well. So I'm really fired up, and it's been an honor to listen to the incredible panelists ICNA has assembled today. My heart goes out to all of you, and I'm with you in solidarity as we figure out how to meet the challenges of this moment head on and fight for a world where Black Americans and Muslim Americans can not only survive, but thrive in this country, which is their country, all of our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Andy. We will now entertain the questions that we have for all of our panelists. So if we can have all the panelists on the screen. There's a few questions that we have, and I guess the reason, one of the things that Musab was mentioning, that this requires action beyond just the hype that we have. So most of these questions are geared towards practical steps. So the first one, I guess, Andy, if I may start with you, is, there's a lot of awesome representatives that we have from the Metro Detroit area. What are the discussions going on now for, to give voice to that community which has been disenfranchised, and how can we as citizens, as residents of the Metro Detroit area, support that cause for you guys?
Well, I would say, first of all, that just because you may have a representative who thinks is with you or, agrees with you, doesn't mean you don't need to reach out to us and tell us. I literally find out about all the comments people make, the phone calls, the emails, the letters. Even if it's, Rashida or Brenda or me or somebody, reach out to us and tell us what you need us to do. It goes into the lawmaking, that happens. And obviously, if you have somebody less sympathetic, make them hear your voice as well. Also, I was on the streets of Macomb County yesterday, Hall Road. My kids are in this car caravan right now as we speak on Woodward in Detroit. Brothers and sisters, in a way that you feel safe, hit the streets. As precious and as important as voting is, and everybody's got to get out there and vote, democracy, it's thin gruel to talk about democracy as just voting. It's freedom of assembly. It's freedom to get in the streets. There are streets. And so that's another way to influence, policy going forward, is to get out and demonstrate, take your mask, take your hand sanitizer, be safe. But, I wouldn't discourage anybody from doing that. And also, we really need to see this systemic racism as something that's an interlinking problem that is going to be very hard to overcome, but that involves healthcare for every person, involves ending mass incarceration, involves real, a living wage for everybody who works. So many things. So we've got to tie the questions about police brutality and reform of policing to the broader questions of economic justice. Those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Representative Andy. Next question I have is for Musab. So Musab, you being the youngest panelist, which is great for us to kind of hear your words on being youth in America. What are things that we need to focus on to make sure that we're better equipped and better educated to tackle this, movement that's coming up?
Well, I think what our brothers Dawood and Mark both mentioned, they kind of invited us to us as Americans to come back and study our own history and understand how ingrained this is in the history of this nation and the founding of this nation. I think that with young people today, my age and even younger than me, I think we have. A lot of good things that we can see is that these brothers and sisters are very passionate. They went out onto the streets. They flooded the streets throughout the country to try to bring some sort of justice and accountability. And I think that's a start. But I think if we look back at the civil rights movement, if we look back at, and I'm talking about just in this country, if we look at Martin Luther King and we look at Malcolm X and we look at these brothers and sisters and their movements, a lot of times the romantic aspect is shown, how they marched on the streets and how they, filled up the streets and how they did the bus boycotts and all those things. But we got to understand that was one aspect of their work. Other than that, they were in the communities, mobilizing, strategizing, educating, serving. I think that's a big thing also. In various poor communities of color, I think young people have a great opportunity to go in and serve the community. I think that in the discussion of mass incarceration, and you look at things like the school to prison pipeline, we have to actually go into the communities that are being hit the hardest by mass incarceration, by police brutality, and we have to start doing relief efforts to uplift those communities. So I think the two things are, we have to educate ourselves, and then we have to mobilize and actually go in and start to serve. It's not just about the protesting. I think protesting is start, but we really have to engage ourselves in service to humanity.
Perfect. Jazakallah khair, Musab. Imam Ilahi, the preceding days, I've just been thinking about what happened in Norway when we had the burning of the holy book of Muslims, and someone leaped out to kind of stop that. So I'm just wondering, what would it take to educate our Muslim community in Metro Detroit area to also have that urge to leap out when we see another one of these cases going down in the books of history? Where do we stand and how do we get to that point?
One of the important issues is interfaith. I think interfaith, not in a sense of ceremonial interfaith, just getting together, have a tea together, and relax, but a meaningful and constructive conversation of faith leaders, especially leaders like the ones recently in Washington. I mean, it's very promising to see courageous Christian leaders, Jewish, Muslim leaders, that if we get together and then bring our communities, not just the leaders to get together and speak, but also to bring the communities together. What Congressman Andy was saying, to defend our democracy, bring our people, our family members, our children on the street to defend our democracy. We may not be able to convince like somebody like Trump through the Quranic verses or Bible or whatever, but at least the language that we all agree, the constitution of the country, that really so many principles in constitution don't have conflict with the things in our faith. The freedom of expression and assembly that Congressman mentioned. I think our community and interface, we need to improve this light, this education, this communication among ourselves, about the real issues, the priorities. And then when something happened, when George Floyd said, "I cannot breathe," then everybody feels the same thing. I cannot breathe either. It should be everybody's voice that I cannot breathe. And then take it to the national conversation, international conversation. So really, as one of the brothers mentioned, the entire world is watching America and what is going on here. And we can set up a very good model for the, and we as Muslims, obviously, we have a lot to contribute, whether immigrants or African American, because what we have in our faith when it comes to racism, that the Quran says the first racist was Shaitan, the Satan was the first racist when God told him to prostrate before Adam, and he said, "Ana khayrun min," I am a better race. And God told him, "Get out of this. You have no place in paradise if you have racist in mentality." So I think to how to mobilize our community to be sensitive and not to be silent against injustice, brutality, and racism is to take interfaith very seriously, that we as leaders of faith, we encourage each other, be united. The time that so many politicians, they try to divide the nation and bring more hatred. So we fix this, we bring more healing, we bring more reconciliation, we bring more unity, we bring more brotherhood. And that happens through education. And I think we as Muslim community, we have a lot to contribute, because we have it in our resources, but it's not to say, oh, just Islam is anti-racism. We have to show it in the practice of the community. And that is to get involved and outreach, as the congressman said, that he likes to listen to us. It's important we listen to them as well. So we exchange the ideas, we exchange the opinions, and we make sure that we are on the same page. Because to succeed in this war against injustice and to win, we need to be united and we need to be together, especially those of us who share the same principles and the same values.
Perfect. Jazakallah khair, Imam Ilahi. So I have a question for Imam Dawood Walid. There's a lot of discussion that's going on, and they're trying to derail the main focal point of this whole movement into a discussion pertaining to rioting and looting. So you, someone who's very involved in that local grassroots work, how do you address that, and how do you respond to those questions that everyone has?
Well, we have to stay focused on the roots of why people are out in the streets to begin with. So as Muslims, we're always supposed to look at asbab, like we look at the occasions and the underlying reasons. And then we should also look at the underlying reasons of why there may be unrest. So has there been some unrest in the streets? Well, it started off because it was a tipping point of people seeing a black man lynched by 4 police officers. Okay, it started with violence from the state. Okay, then people came out to the streets to peacefully protest, and they were met with police officers in military formation. Okay, then some of the same police officers came and then started shooting tear gas. They didn't shoot tear gas at those people holding Confederate flags and guns in Lansing. They didn't shoot tear gas at them, right? And then some people lashed out in response, so-called rioters in some of the cities, as a response to the initial act of violence and then to the provocation by law enforcement. So as Malcolm X said, and we have to be very careful, Malcolm X said, if you're not careful reading or following the media, you will paint the oppressed as the oppressors, or the wrong as the wrongdoers, and then try to look at the people who start the wrong as if they're okay, right? Or as if they're somehow ma'soom, like they're innocent, right? So I think that's the perspective. But we have to be careful. And if I can add on, just as we have to be careful about absorbing some of this other language, like, oh, why are these people out there protesting in the street? Well, why don't they talk about black on black crime? Well, let me tell you about that one too. The majority of white people get killed by white people. The majority of Latinos get killed by Latinos. The majority of African Americans get killed by African Americans. The difference is these are civilian individual acts, whereas when the police kills black people, they're doing it under the banner and the authority of the state with taxpayer dollars based upon policies, right? Or a system, a blue wall. So we can't get confused about the matter and focus more of our attention on a few acts of unrest by a few rioters or a little bit of looting that goes on, when the real issue and the real root of the problem is systemic racism, police violence, and the militarism of police, which, by the way, also many of these police forces have been trained by an outside military force outside of the United States of America in crowd control. So we have to be, they're not acting like peace officers. They're not acting like peace officers. So we need to be clear on that.
Perfect. Very eloquently said, Imam Dawood. Next question for Dr. Ghanem. We see that there's a lot of inherent racist values at the core of a lot of our immigrant communities. Just recently, I was, pointed at that how some of our desserts are named after, racist values. And so my question is that how do we even start that conversation within our communities?
Yes, this is a long overdue conversation that we have to start. The problem is with immigrants like me, we were raised back home on these values. We didn't really come and we didn't inherit it here. We were raised back. I'm originally from Egypt, for example. Egypt, in general, to be white, that means to be beautiful. To be black or be dark, that means to be ugly. So that's one of the values that we were raised as children all over the Middle East for it. So we are not, that's why when we come here, we bring all the things here. And when the system is already like that, so we are already adjusted to the system. So we see black people and we see, we have a problem, for example, between Arabs, how they refuse to marry black girls, for example, white Arab guys, or vice versa. And that's based on decades of inherited culture coming back home. And an example we have a famous song in Egypt for the weddings. They said when they try to say that the bride is so beautiful, they say the bride is white, white, white. So it comes to your mind as a child when you hear that's equal this. If you are white, you are beautiful and you have all the good values, and if you are black or dark, you have all the bad values. Even in countries where the most dominant, like Sudan, for example, most people are dark, but they have racism inside Sudan over the dusk people. So the people have little bit light color are racist toward the people that has dark color, even in a country that everyone will look at them and say they are, African Americans or black. So we bring this here, and we are exposed to the system that's Brother Dawood talked about it. This is the system. This is normal in the system. Racism is embedded in the system. So when you come here, the first thing people will tell you, and this idea will come to you. You came here, you have nothing in you, and within 5 or 6 years, you're a successful physician or a successful lawyer. So black people are sitting here for years. This is their problem, that they are not progressing. You are an example of the system that's giving you a chance. And you take this, yes, I'm an example of the system is working, but you don't understand that the system is actually built not to work. It's built to work for different people and not work for different people. But you think because you are a minority, you think all minorities are the same, or all black people are the same. And because you are ignorant with history, you're not educated on how this systemic injustice, economic, educational, healthcare, going against the black people, and you think I'm succeeding. They are the part of the problem. Then when you are a businessman and you try to start your own business, you go to the inner cities because there is no competition there. White people are not going to open there. You open there, you go to the inner cities, you find Egyptians, Lebanese, Palestinian, Indians opening shops and gas stations there. And what they do, they charge poor people, instead of $1 for a bag of whatever, $1, they charge $5 and $10 for it because they know these people are poor. They don't have cars to go shop at Kroger or shop at Meijer. So we adjust ourselves to be part of this economic injustice against these people. So we're not just sitting in silence, and we're not just having this bad package coming with us. No, we became agent of this economic war against our Black brothers and sisters. So we have to rise up, and this conversation is very, very hard to be said in our masajid. And it's well known because most of our board members in the masajid are wealthy, either physicians or wealthy businessmen, and they don't want this conversation to be happening because this conversation will make them feel uncomfortable. But that a new generation, as Brother Mus'ab said, this is what we're pushing for. We're pushing to open their eyes, and we should not be part of this economic injustice against our brothers and sisters. And our case as immigrants is totally different than the Black case and the Black American case. And this will take a lot of education. And alhamdulillah, the good thing, we started this education maybe years ago, and inshallah, over the next few years, it will be much, much better, inshallah.
That's some great news, Dr. Ghanem. Mark, I have a question for you. When you kind of pointed out at that we need to peel back racism. So how, given the context of Detroit, what are some programs? What are some ways to get involved and to take those practical steps that we need long overdue to peel back these racist values?
Well, I think we need to, number one, while not abandoning to get as much out of this moment as possible, this moment for political change and for reconciliation, I think we also need to just reconcile ourselves with the fact that we're talking about long-term work, right? Just because this is a hot moment doesn't mean that like everything gets solved overnight. It doesn't mean that folks haven't been doing this work for decades upon centuries, right? Like this long pursuit of justice is not something that, hopefully this becomes a watershed moment for more people to get involved in it. So here's what I would offer is that we really should try to see community organizing as a form of service. Okay, we talk about the importance of service in our tradition, and our young brother talked about service earlier. We should try to distinguish between when we look at a situation and we analyze the problem and we analyze, the outcome of that problem. Let's say, it's hunger. We can choose to show up and figure out how to get food to the people who are hungry on a weekly basis through our food pantry or through food delivery or what have you. Or we can try to figure out what policies are missing that are not in place to ensure that these families have access to food and to healthy foods, or what policies are in place or are missing that are challenging their opportunity to make a full living, to enter into the marketplace fully, to not need subsidies at all. Though that's a bigger conversation about where our macro economy is heading and what we'll all need in the future. But my point being that like we should see the value in spending our time, our volunteer time, our donations, the hours that we give to projects that are focused on changing systems through bringing people together, people who are directly impacted, who can tell you what those experiences are like and who can quite often tell you the solutions, bringing them together, working with folks who are allied in this work, in this pursuit of justice, and using that to again seek policy solutions. So I'm not going to give like a policy portfolio right now locally. What I will say is folks, there are a lot of folks in the space, in the social justice space, who are pushing for an end to Detroit's green light program and the surveillance cameras and the entire surveillance network that's being built from that, and that the police department has been very obscure about. When we talk about defunding the police, that's an area where we can cut off funding to and repurpose funding toward community-based solutions for our world. That's one issue that is there. When we talk about advocating to get as many people released. We're still in the midst of COVID and are going to be for the next year. We still have people who are locked in cages who have no way to protect themselves from the transmission of this disease. And we can get more people than we already have out of our county jail systems. We've had some successful cases recently around that. So I would tell folks, get involved on that front with organizations like the Detroit Justice Center, which have been pushing for the rights of incarcerated folks and opportunities, economic and housing and otherwise, for folks after incarceration. And then as Muslims, and I'll close with this, I'm going to make a pitch for, again, giving your time to organizations that are working at that intersection of organizing and policy. Step up and volunteer for Imam Dawood at CARE, Michigan. Matter of fact, if you're an HR person or you're in finance, you should be the first one stepping up to help these nonprofits. We can't absorb the volunteers if we don't have the systems in place. Bring your expertise. But seriously, turn to organizations that are doing organizing work and that are doing policy work, that are plugged into our neighborhoods. And particularly if you're a non-Black Muslim, do not circumvent the Black Muslim experience when you try to engage in racial justice work. You have to understand that we're tied to the work, whether you see it directly or not. And you have to understand that for many of us, speaking from the perspective of a convert, our acceptance of Islam was a part of that journey of confronting with and dealing with racism in this country and all the ways that it presents itself, and the inferiority complex that it causes, and challenging the superiority complex that it represents, and the challenge to equality that it represents. And all of these ways, for a lot of, when we talk about Malcolm X, Imam Jamil El-Amin, Dr. Hassan Bagby, and all of our brothers who are still able to serve us, may Allah protect them and preserve them. I just want to mention that you cannot circumvent our experience if you're a non-Black Muslim. You could be doing more damage to the dawah and less benefit to the movement than you think.
Perfect. Jazakallah khair, Brother Mark. So I think to wrap it up, this is something that we've heard, and we need to not just stop the conversation here. We need to take some physical steps in action and put our money where our mouth is, kind of deal. So with this regard, I actually heard that ICNA Council of Social Justice, along with partnership of some other local organizations, that they're working on planning a peaceful protest. So keep an eye out for that. And I would really like to thank all the panelists for taking your time. I know we went over, but I felt like that these were some of the pressing questions and discussions that were much needed to have. And I'd like to thank our sponsors: Islamic House of Wisdom, CARE Michigan, Dream of Detroit, Metro Detroit Political Action Network, MCWS, IAGD, and Team Center, Tawhid Center. And just to wrap it up, the perfect hadith that comes to my mind is the Prophet ﷺ said that when you see injustice, stand up and stop it by your hand, by your action. If you can't do that, then stop it by your word. And if you can't even do that, then at least feel wrong about it in your heart. So with that, I think we will, inshallah, continue the discussion by more education and action. And I hope that you all would be involved with us to further this cause and movement. So Jazakallah khair to all the attendees, the panelists, the questions. So inshallah, we will talk to you soon. Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallahu khair.
Assalamu alaikum.
Blessing Sunday to everyone.